Section 1, Grandpa's Peaceful Life and Karen's First Accusations. Grandpa had always been known as the quiet strength of Maplewood Estates, a neighborhood that had once been filled with laughter, warm evenings on porches, and children racing bicycles down the wide cul-de-sacs, yet in recent years had begun to suffer under the iron grip of the Homeowners Association, particularly its most vocal, relentless, and self-appointed enforcer, Karen. She was the type of person who measured lawns with, a ruler who called tow trucks when cars were parked a few inches too far onto the street, who patrolled the community with a clipboard like some suburban sheriff, convinced that her interpretation of the rulebook was the only truth worth living by. And to her, Grandpa represented everything she despised: independence, resilience, and the refusal to be bullied by meaningless regulations. Grandpa had lived in Maplewood for nearly 30 years, moving there after retiring from his factory job, choosing the neighborhood for its peaceful atmosphere, its tree-lined sidewalks, and the little garden he could tend behind his modest home. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, but his presence was steady, dignified, and beloved by many who admired the way he kept to his routines: watering flowers in the morning, sipping tea on his porch at dusk, riding his mobility scooter around the block, with a friendly nod and wave to every neighbor he passed. For Karen, though, his existence seemed to be a constant thorn in her side. At first, she complained about the color of his front door, non-compliant with HOA-approved pallets. She insisted. Then about his scooter being parked too close to the sidewalk, then about the flower boxes hanging beneath his windows, each complaint more trivial and absurd than the last, and each one dismissed quietly by the HOA board, who had grown used to her endless crusades. But Karen's obsession with Grandpa escalated beyond the petty when she began whispering to neighbors that his yard was lowering property values, that his scooter was a safety hazard, and that he was violating dozens of rules that she alone seemed to know about, her voice dripping with fake concern while her eyes burned with spite, for she could not tolerate how people adored him, how children laughed when they saw him roll by, how even the sternest HOA members would soften when he offered them a warm smile. In Karen's mind, Grandpa was not just a man, he was a challenge to her authority, a silent rebellion against her need to dominate. The breaking point came one quiet afternoon when Grandpa was trimming his roses, humming to himself, when Karen stormed across the street, her clipboard clutched like a weapon, snapping photos of his home while muttering loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is unacceptable. This is all going into the report." Grandpa, bewildered but calm, asked gently what the issue was this time, only to be met with Karen's shrill declaration that his garden extended 2 inches past the HOA landscaping boundaries, and that his scooter, parked neatly by the porch, was an eyesore, a nuisance, and a liability waiting to happen. Her voice echoed down the street, drawing curious neighbors from their porches, yet Grandpa did not raise his own voice. He simply stood there, pruning shears in hand, looking at her with weary patience, a man too old and too wise to waste energy fighting storms that didn't deserve the thunder. But in that moment, he sensed, quietly, deeply, that Karen would not let go until she found a way to destroy him. Her next step was no longer limited to threats or petty reports. Within weeks, Grandpa received a thick envelope in the mail stamped with official court markings, and when he opened it, his hands trembling ever so slightly, he found that Karen, yes, Karen, had filed a lawsuit against him, accusing him of multiple violations of HOA codes, of reckless endangerment due to his scooter, and of property neglect for his flower beds that neighbors actually adored. It was absurd, laughable even, yet the weight of the legal documents made it anything but a joke, for suddenly Grandpa, a man who had worked hard his entire life, who had never once stepped foot inside a courtroom, was being dragged into a legal battle he had never asked for, facing down the venomous obsession of a woman who would stop at nothing to assert her power. The neighborhood buzzed with shock, whispers spreading like wildfire. "Did you hear? Karen's taking him to court." Some shook their heads in disbelief, others clenched their fists in anger, for everyone knew the truth. Grandpa was kind, responsible, and harmless, but Karen had finally gone too far, weaponizing the legal system to humiliate a man who had done nothing but live his quiet, gentle life. Grandpa sat on his porch that evening, the lawsuit papers heavy in his lap, the fading sunlight brushing across his lined face, and though his heart ached with the weight of what was coming, there was also a fire in his chest, a reminder of the man he used to be, the man who had raised children, who had stood on factory floors through grueling shifts, who had faced life's hardships with grit and determination. And as he looked toward Karen's house, where her blinds twitched with nosy glee, he whispered under his breath, "If she wants to fight, then she'll have one." Section 2. Karen escalates. Turning HOA against Grandpa, the news of Karen's lawsuit spread like a crack through glass, jagged and ugly, dividing Maplewood Estates into those who shook their heads in disbelief and those too intimidated by Karen's constant nagging to say much at all. And as the days slipped into weeks, it became clear that Karen wasn't merely filing paperwork. She was orchestrating an entire campaign, a theater of cruelty designed to break Grandpa's spirit before he ever set foot inside the courtroom. She began with her usual weapons, the HOA meetings where she sat at the head of the long polished table as though she were queen of some suburban empire, her voice sharp and filled with authority she didn't actually possess, declaring Grandpa a chronic violator, waving around photographs she had taken his porch, his scooter, his roses, all of which she framed as evidence of his reckless disregard for community standards. She would speak for an hour straight, her words dripping with venom but clothed in the disguise of responsibility. If we don't act now, his negligence will set a precedent. Property values will plummet. Children will be endangered by his clutter. Maplewood will lose its reputation. Some HOA members rolled their eyes, tired of her endless tirades, but others, those less brave, those who feared being the next target of her clipboard crusades, nodded along, murmuring agreement simply to avoid her wrath. Slowly, insidiously, Karen twisted the narrative. Grandpa was no longer the kind man who waved at neighbors from a scooter, who lent tools to young couples fixing up their homes, who shared vegetables from his garden with single mothers on the block. No, Karen painted him as a menace, a nuisance, a stubborn old man clinging to noncompliance like a badge of rebellion, and her words began to stick in the minds of those who didn't know him as well, those who saw him only from a distance. But Karen wasn't content with lies whispered in meetings. She escalated, marching door to door with flyers she had printed herself, bold black letters screaming "Stop HOA violations, protect our neighborhood," above grainy photos of Grandpa's scooter and garden, cropped and edited to look messy, unsafe, even sinister. She knocked on doors with her sugary smile, saying things like, "I just want what's best for the community, and you should too," while sliding her propaganda into mail slots, confident that repetition would plant seeds of doubt even in the kindest hearts. Some neighbors threw the flyers away immediately, offended by her pettiness, but others, those who feared property values dropping, who believed in rigid rules, began to mutter among themselves, "Maybe Karen has a point." Grandpa, meanwhile, found his evenings growing heavier, for where once children had waved at him, some now stared curiously, their parents pulling them closer as though he were contagious. Where once neighbors had stopped to chat about gardens and weather, some now nodded, curtly avoiding his eyes, and though many still remained loyal, still defended him. The creeping suspicion that Karen had planted was doing its damage, slowly isolating him within the very community he had cherished. And yet, through it all, Grandpa remained composed. He refused to lash out, to sink to Karen's level, instead continuing his quiet routines, watering his roses, tinkering with a scooter, sitting on his porch with dignity intact, even as whispers followed him like shadows. Karen, however, thrived on the tension, feeding on it like a predator savoring fear. She filed motion after motion in court, drowning Grandpa in paperwork, demanding fines, demanding injunctions, even demanding that his scooter be seized until a full safety evaluation was conducted, her words cruelly suggesting that Grandpa's independence itself was a hazard that should be stripped away. The sheer audacity of it all left Grandpa's hands trembling when he read the documents at night, the legal jargon swirling like a foreign language. And though his body ached with age, though his heart weighed heavy with exhaustion, there was also a steel inside him, a defiance that refused to let this woman bully him into submission. What Karen did not anticipate was that while her poison spread, others were quietly awakening to the truth, neighbors who had lived beside Grandpa long enough to know his character, who saw through her theatrics, who whispered to each other in hushed tones, "This is going too far, she's lost her mind." These were the ones who began to rally, slowly at first, bringing over casseroles and kind words, offering to sit with him through HOA meetings, reminding him that he wasn't alone. Yet Karen, blinded by her own fury, mistook his calm silence for defeat, strutting through the neighborhood with a clipboard like a conqueror, boasting that justice will be served when the court removes this liability once and for all, convinced that the law itself would bend to her will. But what Karen failed to understand, what she could never comprehend, was that every step she took to destroy Grandpa only strengthened the resolve of those who loved him. And while she plotted in shadows, Grandpa was quietly gathering light, preparing not just to defend himself, but to expose her cruelty in a way that no one in Maplewood and certainly no judge could ignore. Section 3. Grandpa refuses to back down. Neighbors rally Grandpa had never been the type to seek conflict. He was a man who believed in fixing fences rather than tearing them down, in shaking hands rather than pointing fingers. But as the weight of Karen's lies pressed harder on his shoulders, as the HOA letters multiplied like weeds and the looming court date circled closer on the calendar, something inside him shifted, not with bitterness, but with a firm clarity, a recognition that sometimes silence wasn't strength but surrender, and he was not ready to surrender his dignity to a woman who thrived on intimidation. So, for the first time since the storm began, Grandpa rose not just as a man defending his garden or his scooter, but as a man defending every neighbor who had ever been bullied into silence, every resident too weary or afraid to stand up to Karen's tirades, and though his hands shook as he put on his old jacket and walked into the next HOA meeting, his back was straighter than it had been in years, his eyes sharp with purpose. The room, as always, buzzed with Karen's presence. She had stacked the agenda with accusations against him, her folders bursting with doctored photos and twisted interpretations of bylaws. But when she stood to deliver yet another lecture on community standards, Grandpa did something that stunned everyone. He stood too, his voice quiet at first, quivering from nerves, but growing stronger with each word as he said, "I've lived here longer than most of you. I've seen children grow into, parents and families blossom, and I've spent those years tending to my roses, helping with repairs, keeping to myself, and respecting this neighborhood. I am not perfect, but I am not the villain you've been told I am. I am a man who uses his scooter because his legs don't work like they used to. I am a man who waters his flowers because they give joy to others walking by. And if those things make me a criminal in the eyes of the HOA, then perhaps it's not me who has lost sight of what community means." Silence filled the room, heavy and unbroken, as neighbors exchanged glances, some lowering their eyes in shame for having believed Karen's words, others nodding subtly, emboldened by the courage it took for an old man to speak against the self-appointed queen of Maplewood. Karen sputtered, her rehearsed speech crumbling as she barked, "You are out of order. This is a violation of HOA procedure," but the crack in her armor was visible, her voice shriller than usual, her authority suddenly brittle in the face of Grandpa's calm honesty. That moment planted seeds, real ones, not the poison seeds Karen scattered, and over the days that followed, they began to sprout in unexpected ways. Young parents who remembered Grandpa fixing their fences began stopping by to ask if he needed groceries, teenagers who used to ride past him on bikes slowed down to say hello again, and a quiet but undeniable current of solidarity began to flow through Maplewood, knitting together a resistance against Karen's tyranny. It wasn't dramatic at first. It was casseroles on his porch, neighbors raking his leaves without being asked, whispered promises of, "We'll be there for you in court, don't you worry." But to Grandpa, it was more powerful than any legal defense, for it reminded him he was not alone, not a man abandoned, but a man backed by the very community Karen had tried to weaponize against him. Karen, of course, noticed the shift. She noticed the way people now lingered on Grandpa's porch, the way whispers turned into laughter when she walked by, the way fewer neighbors showed up to her door-to-door rants. And it infuriated her beyond measure. Her smile grew thinner, her clipboard snapped shut harder, and her speeches at meetings became less polished and more desperate, as if she were trying to convince herself, as much as anyone else, that she was still in control. In retaliation, she escalated once again, pushing more paperwork into the court system, slapping Grandpa with outrageous claims that his scooter had damaged community sidewalks, that his roses were attracting dangerous insects, that his very presence was a liability, piling on absurdities in hopes that the sheer volume of accusations would bury him alive. But Karen had underestimated something crucial. When a bully overreaches, the mask slips, and people begin to see the cruelty behind the rules. Grandpa, bolstered by the kindness of his neighbors and the steel of his own conscience, refused to retreat. He spent late nights with a small circle of supporters at his kitchen table, poring over HOA bylaws, highlighting inconsistencies, gathering letters of testimony from those who had benefited from his kindness, collecting photographs of the true Maplewood. Children smiling in front of his roses, neighbors enjoying the shade of his porch, firefighters thanking him for once donating water during a summer blaze, and with every piece of evidence, his defense grew not just stronger, but more human, more rooted in truth than Karen's theatrics could ever hope to be. He began to walk through the neighborhood with his head high again, greeting everyone with his usual warmth, but now carrying the quiet aura of a man unbroken, a man whose fight was no longer about a scooter or a rose bush, but about dignity, respect, and the simple right to live in peace. The night before the court date, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Karen was seen strutting about, boasting to anyone who would listen that tomorrow the judge will put an end to this nonsense, while in Grandpa's home lights glowed warmly as neighbors gathered, drinking tea, offering hugs, promising to sit in the courtroom pews as witnesses not just of the law but of truth. Grandpa looked around that evening, eyes misty as he whispered, "I never thought I'd see the day where I'd be the reason people came together. But maybe that's the silver lining, maybe she wanted to break me, but all she's done is remind me how much goodness still lives here." And with that, the old man went to bed, not free of fear, but filled with the courage that comes when you know your fight is just and that you no longer fight it alone. Section 4. The Dramatic Court Battle. Truth revealed the morning of the court date arrived heavy with anticipation, as though even the sky understood the weight of what was about to unfold, the clouds hanging low, the air sharp with the scent of autumn. And as Grandpa buttoned his coat with trembling but determined fingers, he felt not only the ache of his joints, but the quiet strength of those who had gathered behind him, neighbors standing outside his home with encouraging smiles, offering rides, holding up signs that read, "We stand with Grandpa," their presence a living shield against the fear that tried to creep in. He wheeled his scooter slowly toward the courthouse, flanked by families he had known for decades, teenagers holding thermoses of coffee for him, elderly neighbors gripping his arm as if to lend him their courage, and when they entered the courthouse lobby, the sight stopped even the clerks in their tracks. A procession of ordinary people united in defense of one old man against the iron grip of an HOA tyrant. Karen, of course, was already there, perched on a bench like a smug vulture, her bright red blazer sharp against the dull marble walls, her stack of binders piled high beside her like trophies, her lips curved in a thin smile that only widened when she saw Grandpa approach. She leaned over to her lawyer, whispering something smug, then called out in a voice deliberately loud enough for the crowd to hear, "Well, look who finally dragged himself here. Don't worry, this will all be over quickly. You'll be gone by the end of the day." The words, dripping with venom, might have cut deep if Grandpa were alone, but when dozens of voices whispered back, "We're with you," or patted his shoulder, Karen's poison lost its sting. And for the first time, it was she who looked rattled, her smirk faltering at the sight of so much solidarity. The courtroom itself was both intimidating and strangely intimate, its wooden benches creaking under the weight of neighbors who filled every seat, the stern gaze of the judge, a silver-haired woman with eyes sharp as flint, sweeping across the room before settling on Karen with the kind of look reserved for people who mistake arrogance for authority. The proceedings began with Karen's lawyer, a slick man with too much confidence and too little substance, rattling off accusations like bullets. Grandpa's scooter was a hazard, his roses an infestation, his very presence a liability to community harmony. Each claim was read with dramatic pauses, accompanied by carefully angled photographs blown up on glossy poster boards, an image of Grandpa's scooter slightly askew on the sidewalk, a close-up of a bee on a rose petal, a picture of his porch cluttered with garden tools, but what they thought were smoking guns only looked pitiful when viewed in the whole. Neighbors stifled gasps, some shook their heads, a few even chuckled quietly because anyone who had walked past Grandpa's home knew these problems were nothing more than normal life, twisted into petty ammunition. Grandpa sat quietly, hands folded, his face calm, but his heart racing, waiting, listening, until at last the judge turned to his side of the courtroom and said, "You may respond." That was when the tide turned, for Grandpa did not speak alone. His lawyer, a young woman from the community who had offered to represent him pro bono, stood tall and clear. But instead of diving into legal jargon, she began with something more powerful: humanity. "Your Honor," she said firmly, gesturing to Grandpa, "this is not a case about violations of rules. This is a case about harassment. My client is a 76-year-old veteran, a neighbor who has lived peacefully in Maplewood for over 3 decades. He is being targeted not because of his actions, but because of one person's obsession with control." She then laid out the evidence Grandpa and his supporters had painstakingly gathered: photographs of neighborhood children playing by his roses, sworn letters testifying that his scooter never blocked walkways, records showing his compliance with every legitimate HOA request over the years, even testimonials from firefighters recalling how Grandpa's garden hose had once helped keep flames at bay during a grass fire. Each piece dismantled Karen's claims, not with anger but with undeniable truth, and as the evidence mounted, the judge's brow furrowed deeper, her pen tapping sharply against her desk as if punctuating every hole in Karen's story. But the moment that broke the dam came not from documents or arguments, but from the people themselves. One by one, neighbors stood up to testify, their voices trembling with emotion but steady in truth. A mother recounted how Grandpa had repaired her fence after a storm for no payment. A teenager admitted that the roses near his porch had been the backdrop for her prom photos. An elderly widower confessed that Grandpa's daily greetings had helped him through grief, each story painting not the picture of a nuisance, but of a pillar of the community. Karen tried to object, waving her arms and hissing to her lawyer, but the judge silenced her with a sharp glare, allowing every testimony to be heard. By the time the last neighbor finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, except Karen's, whose face had hardened into a mask of fury, her hands clenched white around her binder as if she could squeeze reality back into her control. And then, finally, the judge turned her gaze on Karen, her voice cutting through the silence with chilling precision. "I have heard enough. These accusations are baseless, exaggerated, and malicious. It is clear to this court that the plaintiff has abused HOA authority in an attempt to harass and intimidate a resident who has done nothing wrong." The words rang like a gavel strike before the gavel even fell, and in that moment, the balance of power that Karen had clung to for years shattered in front of everyone's eyes. Grandpa exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his shoulders sagging with relief as neighbors squeezed his hands, whispered, "We told you," and even the judge, her stern face softening for a brief moment, gave him a nod of respect as if to say, "You endured and you won." Karen, on the other hand, could only sputter, but he violated, this isn't fair," her voice shrill, echoing pathetically against the wood-paneled walls. But the judge cut her off with a single phrase that sealed her fate: "The only thing unfair here is the harassment you've inflicted." Case dismissed. The gavel slammed down, final and unforgiving, and the courtroom erupted in applause, not the raucous kind, but the heartfelt kind. Like the release of years of tension, the sound of justice finally prevailing against tyranny. Karen stormed out, her red blazer flashing like a warning light, but her power had dissolved, her authority gutted by truth, her reputation shredded in front of the very people she had sought to dominate. Grandpa remained seated for a moment, overwhelmed, eyes misting as he whispered, "I never wanted to fight, I just wanted to live in peace." And in that small statement lay the heart of the entire battle. He hadn't sought revenge, but justice had found him anyway. Section 5. Judge's ruling, Karen's humiliation, and Grandpa's lasting triumph as the gavel echoed one final time through the courtroom, sealing Karen's defeat and confirming Grandpa's innocence. A wave of relief and jubilation washed over Maplewood Estates, a wave that seemed to ripple far beyond the wooden benches, the marble floors, and the polished brass of the courtroom doors, spilling into the streets, the porches, and the hearts of everyone who had quietly waited for justice to prevail, for a man who had been hounded, belittled, and harassed simply for living his life with dignity to finally see the truth acknowledged and celebrated. Neighbors, some still teary-eyed, hugged Grandpa, clapped him on the shoulder, and whispered words of gratitude for the lessons he had imparted simply by enduring, teaching everyone that courage was not about aggression, but about standing firm in one's truth, that integrity and kindness could withstand even the most relentless attacks, and that the collective strength of a community could overcome obsession and cruelty. Karen, meanwhile, stood frozen, her carefully curated image shattered into 1,000 irreparable fragments, her red blazer now seeming almost comically bright against the somber reality that she had lost, that her obsession, her endless filing of frivolous complaints, her manipulations, and her attempts to humiliate a gentle old man had not only failed, but had revealed her pettiness, her vindictiveness, and her own isolation. She opened her mouth to argue, to demand reconsideration, to wave her folders like a shield, but the judge's final words had already stripped her of any power. The plaintiff has failed to present credible evidence, has acted in bad faith, and has used HOA authority to harass a neighbor. This case is dismissed in its entirety with costs awarded to the defendant. There was a finality in the statement, an unmistakable authority that left Karen blinking, speechless, and visibly shaken. While the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively, the tension dissipating like mist under morning sunlight, replaced by laughter, tears of joy, and a palpable sense of victory for Grandpa and all who had stood with him. Outside the courthouse, the scene was almost surreal. Neighbors who had come to witness the trial or simply support Grandpa were now cheering openly, children clapping and waving signs that read "Grandpa wins" and "Justice for Maplewood." While the media, which had begun to take notice of this David versus Goliath struggle between an elderly man and an overzealous HOA member, snapped photos capturing the moments of relief, joy, and triumph that seemed almost cinematic in their intensity, Grandpa, seated on his cherry red scooter, looked around at the smiling faces, the tears, the children dancing with handmade banners, and he felt something that transcended personal victory. He felt the embodiment of community spirit, the realization that when people come together in truth and support, even the most relentless tyranny can be overcome. Karen, by contrast, slunk away, her furious mutterings lost amidst the roar of celebration, her credibility destroyed not by force but by exposure, and in that public humiliation she became a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when obsession, envy, and pettiness collide with integrity and courage. Grandpa, ever the humble man, did not let the celebration sweep him into arrogance. He waved gently to the crowd, tipping his tweed cap, smiling softly as neighbors brought him flowers, gifts, and even homemade treats, a testament to their love and gratitude. The firefighters who had once stood by him during scooter disputes now gave him a thumbs up, their presence a reminder that he had allies beyond the courtroom. Allies who valued not the rules, but the spirit of the community and the protection of those who had earned respect through decades of quiet, consistent kindness. Stories of Karen's absurd accusations, her endless filings, and her courtroom meltdown spread quickly through Maplewood and beyond, shared with laughter, disbelief, and moral lessons embedded in every retelling, while Grandpa's dignified patience, his refusal to retaliate with anger, and his reliance on truth and support became legendary, inspiring neighbors to stand for what is right and to never bow to intimidation, no matter how loud, how persistent, or how absurd the aggressor may be. In the weeks that followed, Maplewood returned to a peaceful rhythm, but with subtle shifts. Children played near Grandpa's garden without fear, neighbors stopped by to share stories, and the HOA, chastened by the public spectacle and the court's decision, adopted a quieter, more respectful approach to residents, a tacit acknowledgement that Karen's brand of tyranny would no longer be tolerated. Grandpa continued his daily routines, watering his roses, sipping tea on the porch, riding his scooter with a quiet smile and a nod to every passerby. But now he did so with an added aura of triumph, a gentle heroism earned through patience, courage, and the unwavering support of his community. And as for Karen, she became a cautionary footnote in the story of Maplewood, remembered not for her authority, but for her obsession, her hubris, and her spectacular public defeat. While Grandpa's victory endured not just as a legal triumph, but as a moral one, a story whispered through Porch's streets and neighborhood gatherings for years to come. That truth